So I am at the National Salt Satyagraha Memorial, sometimes also known as the 241 Memorial. Known as the 241 Memorial also because the distance from Ahmedabad to Dandi has been calculated at 241 miles. No one ever did that calculation, incidentally, at that time. And it is one of Gandhi's earlier biographers, one of his early biographers in India, in any case, post-independence period, B.R. Nanda, who first mentioned 241 miles. And ever since then, people have been referring to the distance as 241 miles. But this particular mural that I wish to speak about, and this video will concentrate only on this mural and the subject around it, is of particular interest because it shows, as even a casual look at the mural will suggest, it shows only male marchers, only male figures. So here are a couple of questions that we have to think about. The first is, what is the role of women in the Salt Satyagraha, in the non-violent movement? That the non-violent movement is a very large subject, so let's just think about the Salt Satyagraha. And the second question with which I begin is a more specific, a more pointed question, a question that in fact has something of a critique within it. And that is that it is now well known to people who have studied the Salt March that Gandhi handpicked 78 people who would accompany him on the march. It turned out to be eventually a total of 81, including Gandhi himself, because 2 marchers joined at the end. And these 80 marchers were all men. Women were excluded. And the question has arisen, of course, why were they excluded? And in particular, does that suggest to some kind of sexism or discrimination against women on the part of Gandhi? Now, if you read the autobiographies of elite Indian women, such as Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, I give her as an instance of the kind of women who became very prominent in the struggle for freedom. Of course, another very notable person, and I'll turn to in a moment, is Sarojini Naidu. And in fact, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay and Sarojini Naidu are related to each other. Now, Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, in her memoir published in 1984 for the first time, a book called Inner Spaces, Outer Recesses, she points out that something that a great many other women, elite women, have pointed out in their memoirs and autobiographies. Namely, that it was under Gandhi that women became part of the public sphere in India for the first time. It was precisely because the movement was a non-violent movement that women felt more comfortable in it, and families permitted their daughters, knowing that this movement was being led by someone like Mohandas Gandhi, with the kind of obviously ethical principles that he adhered to, and the fact that he adhered very strongly to the idea of non-violence. This encouraged these families to send their daughters out, the daughters who were interested in activism and in joining the movement. And these families sent their daughters out and said, well, go ahead and join the movement, go out into the streets, because it wasn't common really for women to go into the streets. I'm well aware of the fact that in the Swadeshi movement, back in the earlier part of the 20th century, in 1905 and the few years thereafter, there were women who were part of that movement as well, right? But what I'm speaking about here is the entry of large number of middle-class Indian women who had never been part of Indian public life. Now, therefore, it becomes important to understand why Gandhi decided to exclude these women from the original band of marchers. We have to bear in mind, of course, that when he arrives at Dandi, there is a large crowd of people. That crowd of people certainly included women, and there were women volunteers who were part of the non-cooperation movement. We know as well that the second most important event after the Dandi March, which is part of the history of the Salt Satyagraha, is what is called the raid on the Darsana salt works. Right? Well, something like 50 kilometers from here, approximately. And this raid on the Darsana salt works was led by Sarojini Naidu. We have a number of nationalist prints, brilliant prints, which show her at the helm, at the front of a group of people, large group of people, right, leading this raid, as it's called. The word raid is often used in the prints because what they were trying to do was they were trying to say, we don't accept the British monopoly, right, on the distribution, sale, manufacturing of salt. And this Darsana Salt Works was one such place where there was the production of salt. Right? And unlike the Dandi March, where the march itself did not, eventually it would lead the Salt Satyagraha to the arrests of thousands, tens of thousands of people, but there was no violence here at Dandi Beach or along the way, really. But this is very different in the case of the Darsana Salt Works, where, of course, and there was as is known from reports at that time, and perhaps the most famous report was a report by an American journalist who was there by the name of Webb Miller, whose telephonic reports, telegrams on what was happening here made the Salt Satyagraha known around the world. And one of the things that he suggested was that the brutal violence unleashed upon the volunteers led by Sarojini Naidu, that moment signified the complete collapse of any moral authority the British had ever supposed to exercise. It showed the evil, corrupt, and repressive nature of British rule. Now, what this establishes is that women were certainly part of the Salt Satyagraha. And in fact, often, as in the case of Sarojini Naidu, in positions of leadership. So let's return to the question, and with that we will conclude this short video. Why is it that women were excluded? The reason women were excluded among the hand-picked volunteers, okay, it's also important to understand that the bulk of these volunteers were the inhabitants of Sabarmati Ashram, not all of them. And in a separate video I'm going to describe some of the marchers and their backgrounds. But women were excluded because Gandhi's principal claim here was that if we have women, the British will use that as an argument to say, Mohandas Gandhi and these volunteers were essentially using the women as a cover, as a shield. Now, Gandhi's view seems a little bit bizarre to those who don't understand, in part, the distinction between non-violence of the brave or non-violence of the strong, which is a phrase that he used, and non-violence of the weak. One of the things that Gandhi argues is that in a non-violent movement, and when one is offering satyagraha to one's oppressor, one must give the oppressor every opportunity to oppress one. That is to say, let me rephrase this so that it becomes a bit more palatable to our understanding. That it is imperative that the non-violent resistor face the strongest possible odds that he or she can think of. Right? So you, in a manner of speaking, invite the oppressor to say, all right, there are no women now here, unleash all the violence that you want upon us and we will not be deterred. But if you have women included, this is going to deter the British, possibly. I say possibly, of course, because part of the British self-representation was this idea that we're a people who believe in chivalry, and our culture and our ethics does not permit us to beat women, right? It does not permit us to unleash violence upon women. Of course, that's, frankly, let's use a casual word, rubbish, because we know exactly how the English dealt with the suffragettes in the early part of the 20th century in England itself, when women were agitating for the right to vote. Right? But nevertheless, this is the British self-representation, and they use it constantly in their colonies. And so what Gandhi is saying is that, look, and this is where I go back to the distinction between non-violence of the strong and non-violence of the weak. Let us not forget that when Noakhali happened in 1946, and people began to unleash violence upon each other, and then eventually when we get to partition, Gandhi is the first person who says, now that the British are about to leave India, it is becoming very clear that our non-violence was always the non-violence of the weak, not the non-violence of the strong. If you do not have the opportunity to use violence, right, let's say you don't have access to arms, and you resort to non-violence, that is not the non-violence of the strong. Non-violence of the strong also entails the idea that one must not simply renounce arms, that one must renounce them when one has the opportunity to use them. And moreover, the non-violence of the strong has to do not simply with the resistance, it has to do with the idea that non-violence is in fact a way of being in the world. It's a way of living one's life, right? And so when one goes back to this mural here, this fresco, and you don't see any women here, then you begin to think yourself, why is it that there are no women? Why were all the initial marchers, the ones who were handpicked by Gandhi, why were they all men? And I think we have to understand this was based not really even in any kind of cultural idea, nor was this based on the idea that women are weak. Not even remotely. It is in fact men who are much weaker than women according to Gandhi, because women, from Gandhi's standpoint, are far more adapted to the idea of nonviolent resistance. The principal reason women were excluded had to do with Gandhi's understanding both of the politics of culture and what is it that really makes possible the satyagraha of the strong.